So in preparation for the upcoming Euros, we've decided to do a series of workshops on adjudication. This workshop will be about feedback, and I'm going to cover three main areas. Firstly, I'm going to cover how to take notes in order to improve the feedback that you're going to give at the end of the debate. Second of all, I'm going to discuss how to give better rationale, so as in how to explain to teams that they came in the position that they did. And finally, I'm going to talk about personal feedback and how we can start doing that better so that debaters improve from the feedback that we give them. Starting off with how to take notes throughout the round. Now, this is something I think is incredibly crucial in in changing the feedback that we give after the round, and I think it starts in the way that we take our notes. So what I recommend doing is while you're taking your notes, have a separate piece of paper where you write two things down. First of all, you write the bottom lines each team's attempted to prove. Okay? So either attempted or actually did prove, right? Secondly, I like to write down the conclusions I have about each one of these points. This doesn't have to be a fully fledged conclusion. This could be just a note that you have about it or a piece of feedback that you have about it, or just the words underanalyzed. I think this is also useful during the discussion and during coming to a call, but I think this proves useful while giving feedback. A couple of things to note about what I mean by bottom lines. Okay, first of all, bottom lines isn't necessarily what teams identified that their bottom line is going to be. So if a team says, I'm going to prove X, that doesn't necessarily mean that that bottom line will be written down because X isn't necessarily what they proved, right? They may have actually proved something different, right? Second of all, when you putting the bottom lines that they proved isn't necessarily something that they said they were going to prove. It could be something like a characterization that they made throughout the debate that might be useful to the debate and to how you judge that debate, right? So the reason that you do this is because when you're giving the rationale, being able to call out specific points is much better insofar as teams understand that you actually listen to them because you're not referencing the practical point that they made, you're referencing the actual argument that they made, saying this is going to increase the protection that people have in prisons, right? So that makes teams understand that you actually did follow what happened throughout the debate and makes giving that feedback much easier when you're doing it. The second thing this does is that you also have your notes on those points right there. So when it comes time to giving personal feedback or when it comes time to giving the rationale, these explanations are much easier to access because they're written down. Now, before feedback starts, and I think this is not necessarily things that you would write down during the actual round, but I think it makes sense to take a minute to organize your notes in the same way that a speaker has their notes organized and takes a 15 minutes or throughout the round writes down notes. It makes sense that as a chair, you should have notes written down as well. So I recommend doing this throughout the debate in order to make that as fast as possible after the debate. But even if you don't do this throughout the debate, after you've decided your call, it makes sense to have something written down for you to structure your feedback based on that. Okay? So those are things you can do throughout the debate with how you write it down, having a separate piece of paper in order to make feedback be more compelling and be more useful for teams. So let's get on to giving the call, right? Um, I think this splits into three sections. Firstly is when you give the call, make it clear that first you're going to give the ranking, right? So first, second, third, fourth. Then you're going to give rationale. And then this is something that changes from circuit to circuit. So the Israeli circuit, for example, gives personal feedback to everyone at the same time. But at least in most places in Europe, that isn't the case. Give either personal feedback afterwards or personal feedback. Tell people they can come up to you after the debate and actually stay there in order to give people that personal feedback, right? Just saying that you're willing to give the personal feedback if they find you like 4 hours later drunk in the social isn't really helpful. Staying there after you've given the rationale is much more useful in giving personal feedback. So let's get into giving the actual rationale, right? There are three methods to giving rationales. Firstly is going in order of teams. So that is basically telling the story of what happened in the debate. Opening government gets up and says uh, 1, 2, 3. Then opening opposition respond by saying X and as in give the following rebuttal and give the following points, right? So this gives you a kind of easy way to explain the flow of the debate, since this is in essence what actually happened. The second advantage that this has is that it allows you to go through 6 comparisons, right? So after you've explained opening opposition and the comparison between opening government and opening opposition, you then talk about closing government and what they've added to the debate. And at that point, you compare closing government to opening opposition and to opening government, right? And I think that makes sure that the call is as clear as possible, right? Um, Secondly, the second method of rationale is to do this by clashes, as in here in the same way that a whip speech says, here are the clashes in the debate. Here is how Team X won this clash and why this clash is more important than that clash. I think if you do this, you can also explain the call through that. I recommend doing this slightly less for two main reasons. One is teams don't necessarily know when they should be paying most attention. So obviously, it's hard for teams to pay attention for the entire rationale, which they should be doing, but they won't necessarily be doing. But when you're talking about that team, it's important and crucial that they listen to the rationale so that they understand their rankings and are able to learn as much as possible from their ranking, as in why it went well or badly and how I can improve that next time, right? Now, clashes makes that slightly difficult because you don't necessarily know when we're going to be talking about that specific team, okay? So the second thing that is problematic with giving it based on clashes is that you oftentimes miss out on points because they're slightly irrelevant to the clashes, to most of the clashes in the debate, and so you could mention them, but they end up being slightly uncomparative to what you get. And I think teams tend to feel that you've missed out on some of their points and feel that they aren't heard, right? Um, the third method is by rankings. So here you can do it either first to fourth or fourth to first. I always like doing fourth to first because I think the team that's fourth at this point really wants to hear why they're fourth. So instead of making them wait the entire uh, um, other comparisons in order to do that, I think starting with them kind of makes that easier for them to understand the call. But also, the other thing I'll note about giving rankings based on uh, base giving the rationale based on rankings is that you should be doing the 6 comparisons, right? What I mean by that is you should be comparing why third beat fourth, why second beat third and beat fourth, and why first beat second and first beat third and first beat fourth. Because sometimes you fall into a trap of getting into a situation where the specific reason you give one team over another is clear why they beat that team, but not necessarily why they beat the team below them. So I think it's useful to give the full 6 comparisons or the minimum 6 comparisons that you can do there, right? Um, then what you should be doing if you are going to give the based on rankings, as I said, I think fourth to first is useful. Um, and if you're going to give by order of teams, so you would give opening government's case, opening opposition's rebuttal, opening opposition's case, and then opening government's rebuttal. That way you're closing the loop and making sure that you're getting into all of the entirety of the case that people bring. The last thing I'll say, and I think this is true about all methods of giving rationale, is that you should be putting forth to teams what points you got from them. So if I were to do a rationale based on rankings, I would say the reason so opening opposition beat opening government. Okay, so opening opposition give us the following 4 things. 1, 2, 3, 4. Opening government, give us these three cases, 1, 2, 3, and then compare those two cases against each other, right? What this does is it makes sure that you're doing the entire comparison that happens, but also making sure that teams understand that you really listen to them. And this, I'll connect it a little bit to what I said about while you're taking notes. This becomes both easier and clearer why you're doing this when you take notes, notating what the points people have given are. Then when you're giving what they are, obviously you're not going to say every sentence that they said. So I think the three things that it's important to flag in your rationale is, firstly, points that the teams themselves flag. So even if this point wasn't actually ever proven, saying you said you would prove X as a case that a team brought is useful insofar as they now know that you listened to them. Second is rebuttals. So I would say here are the cases and rebuttals that you've given, and that way you're spreading out the entire field of important information. Thirdly, I still think that you should um, discuss the points that people made that aren't necessarily flagged. So bringing back to the example that we said in the writing section, you should discuss if someone made a characterization that is useful for the debate. But the differentiation I'd make over here is that you only bring up non-flagged points if they are important, right? So you're not gonna discuss every single non-flagged point that someone said, any aside that people said, because then rationale would take too long. But if something is important, then you would discuss it even if it's not flagged, right? So we said discuss flagged points, discuss rebuttal, and discuss non-flagged points if and only if they're important. Right. So that's how I think that's how I recommend giving the rationale and how to give it in a way that is useful and easier for teams to follow. Personal feedback. Okay. So a couple of things to note about personal feedback. Firstly, is you're trying to help, not prove you're smart. So I've heard a lot of personal feedback that goes something to the extent of, yes, I know what you were referencing, and I read that article, and actually, you mischaracterized Bentham in the way that he discussed this. Sure, very impressive that you read that or whatever, but that doesn't help the team. The main goal that we're trying to reach in personal feedback is to make sure that the round after this is going to be better, right? So the things that I think you should give personal feedback off of are a couple. One is things that they could have done better that don't necessarily go into rationale. And here's something that I'm going to put as a disclaimer. Before I give personal feedback, I like to explain that personal feedback is separate from rationale. As in, I may say things in personal feedback that mean that are advice that you could do better, but that don't mean necessarily that I lowered your rank or raised your rank because of that, right? So if I said your structure could have been better, I didn't necessarily say you lost opening government because that structure wasn't good, but I think this is something that could be useful for the next round, right? So things that they could have done better that aren't part of rationale. For example, so a couple of things going into here. One is examples that worked or didn't work, right? That example actually ended up being slightly two-sided, right? It could fall to either side of the debate. But that example was the second example was very useful. Another thing you can give feedback on is better rhetorical phrasing that they could have used in order to compel, right? So instead of calling drone strikes, if you are on the side of drone strikes, saying that they're killing people, you could have said that they're neutralizing enemies, right? Saying the same thing, but using words that make it sound better, right? Uh, Places where their analysis could have been better, not necessarily something that ended up being part of the debate, but just tweaks to their argumentation that could have made their argumentation better, or arguments or premises that, though they weren't attacked, and so I didn't discuss them in rationale, they weren't very robust, and you could have A, you should notice that they weren't very robust, and B, you could strengthen them in the following ways. Another thing you can give feedback on in personal feedback is structure, as I said earlier. But you can also discuss case strategy. So, what you think could have been useful to run here, what you think they should be thinking of when going into this room in this round. Um, and I think that's something that chairs are often able to give to shed light on that teams don't necessarily think about, and I think that could be useful. And finally, one other thing to give personal feedback on is discussing other options that they are able to other cases that they could have run, especially when they can be used in other debates. So this isn't something that is very specific, tailored to this debate that I would discuss in case strategy, but something that is a case that is useful in most intervention debates, for example, right? And finally, the last thing I'll say about personal feedback is that if you give feedback to someone a couple of times, so you've judged them in a couple of rounds, I'd start thinking about what patterns seem to be emerging and how can you either fix or strengthen the patterns that are emerging. And I think that could be an extremely useful thing if chairs learn to notice th- learn to notice patterns and try and help people in those patterns. Hope this was helpful, and look forward to seeing you at Euros.